Ascendai, The Destiny Crest. Audiobook by Robinson and Walsh. Chapter 4, Tragedy. The wall of snow was going to overtake the Cantrells. They needed to act fast. "Let's get out of here," Jim yelled. "Everyone hold on tight." Without a word, Natalie quickly followed Jim as they headed directly away from the oncoming avalanche. The snowmobile's engines strained as they were pushed to their limits. They were going as fast as they could, but the snow was still rapidly gaining on them. Jim didn't know what to do and was in agony with his helplessness. All he could think of was to try and get as much distance between his family and the oncoming snow as possible. As they raced through the forest, he searched in vain for a place where his family could take cover. In his mind, he urged Natalie, with his two little girls behind her, faster and faster. The terrain headed away from the danger was off trail and very rough. The children were being bounced around all over the place as they struggled to hold on. Colt, holding on to his dad as tight as he could, began wrapping his wrists in and around the straps of his father's pack. It helped lock him in place and made him feel a little bit safer. The harsh terrain tossed him and Jim up and down violently, but Colt was not going to let go. Natalie, following close behind her husband, prayed frantically for a miracle. She could feel the press of Candy and Sandy behind her, clinging so tight to her that she could barely breathe. The snow they were traveling over was very deep and there were trees everywhere. It took Jim and Natalie's complete concentration to navigate their vehicles around the trees without smashing into them. If the circumstances had been different, Jim and Colt would have been impressed with how well Natalie and the girls handled themselves. They had no trouble keeping up with them as they tore through the forest. The sound of the destruction behind them was getting closer and closer. It was so close that Colt could feel the sudden drop in temperature as the tidal wave of snow began to overtake them. The wall of snow reached the girls first and threw them forward, pushing them a bit beyond Jim and Colt. Jim squeezed harder on the gas in a desperate attempt to go faster. The wave of snow reached Jim and Colt 2 seconds later. It was like being caught in a crashing wave as it slams into rocks near the ocean shore. All Colt could see was bright white, and he could feel the back end of the snowmobile begin to rise upward, forcing the vehicle into a nosedive. Natalie looked to the left just in time to see the two men in her life vanish as they were swallowed up by the snow. A second later, the snow overtook her and the twins. The force of the impact immediately knocked her and the girls off the snowmobile. She tried frantically to twist around and grab her children as she tumbled through the air. She got a brief glimpse of their frightened faces before they were swept away. Then all she could see was white. Colt and Jim had managed to somehow stay on their snowmobile as it flipped end over end. The force of the avalanche tossed them into the air so high that for a moment they floated free of the destruction below. Up ahead they saw where the mountainside abruptly ended in a massive cliff. The vehicle began falling downward and was once again overtaken by the surge of snow. As they sank out of sight, their momentum was halted as they slammed into a tree. The force of the collision threw them off the snowmobile. Colt squeezed Jim's backpack as tightly as he could, refusing to let him go as they were tossed around like rag dolls. Helplessly, the two were dragged towards the edge of the cliff in certain doom. Jim fought furiously against the pull of the snow. All he could think about was the young boy clinging to his back and the rest of his missing family. The hopelessness of the situation filled him with rage as he realized he was at the mercy of the mountain. The pressure of the snow was so great on Colt that he felt as if he were being crushed. He felt the pressure of the backpack straps on his wrists and knew if he hadn't wrapped himself so tightly in them, he would have never been able to hold on. He had no control of his body as it was twisted and tossed around until he was flung helplessly over the edge of the cliff. Natalie felt pain coursing through her body as she was thrown about violently. Her heart was filled with agony as thoughts of her family ran through her mind as she rapidly tumbled down the mountainside. Mind and body broken, the wind was knocked out of her as she slammed into a tree and came to an immediate stop. The mountain of snow pinned her against the tree. She barely had enough time to take a deep breath before she was buried alive. Colt felt weightless as he was tossed into the air and then thrown over the edge of a giant cliff. He was unable to see because he was completely surrounded by massive amounts of snow and ice. He could tell he was in the air and knew what had happened. He was being violently driven towards the canyon below, and there was nothing he could do about it. In a few seconds it will all be over, he thought. He squeezed tighter and tighter to Jim as he anticipated the end. He was suddenly hit square in the face with extreme force. He felt blood rushing down his face as he was struck repeatedly on his arms, legs, and chest, slowing his descent. The pain seemed endless until a sudden snatch on his arms made him come to an abrupt stop. The suddenness of his stop caused his head to whip backward, striking a solid object and knocking him out. The ski patrol reacted quickly when the avalanche hit, sounding an alarm to let everyone know to take immediate shelter. The avalanche had destroyed most of the mountain in mere minutes, and hundreds of people were unaccounted for. Local law enforcement was also notified and search parties were formed. Everyone knew that every second counted if lives were going to be saved. The mountain looked as though a bomb had gone off. Most of the trees were gone, being either completely uprooted or snapped in half. Only a couple of the most mature trees had survived the destruction. About 400 acres of the resort property was presumed hit, and 45 of the 62 ski and snowmobile trails were now buried in 20 feet of snow or more. Nearly all the trails were impassable, and the terrain had completely changed. The damaged mountain seemed unfamiliar to the ski patrol, and even the most veteran mountaineers could barely recognize the landscape. The search parties pressed on for hours. Several bodies were recovered, and as the hours stretched on, the searchers became more and more disheartened as they found no sign of life anywhere. They looked futilely for flares, emergency beacons, or signal fires that meant somebody had survived. It seemed hopeless as the death toll rose to 72, with 95 people still unaccounted for. It didn't take long for the news of the catastrophe to spread, and within an hour the resort was full of news crews, eager to get the story. Back at the resort, a member of the ski patrol had come forward. He had overheard the deal George Vanderhaven had made with a fellow patrol member and believed that this was the cause of the avalanche. The story was confirmed when the accused patrol member was brought in and confessed to everything. Harvey was then picked up and confessed to the part he had played in the incident. The avalanche was all over primetime news, and when it was revealed that the tragedy was caused by the sons of the high-profile businessman Montgomery Vanderhaven, it had every reporter around chomping at the bit to tell the story. Montgomery Vanderhaven was in the middle of a board meeting when the story went public. His first reaction was fear for the loss of his sons. Then, as the negative publicity started spiraling about, the inner businessman took over. He started considering ways he could take advantage of the free publicity from the news coverage, while also combating the negativity that was being directed at himself and his company. Colt slowly opened his eyes, surprised to see that he was still alive. His body ached all over, both of his arms were numb, and he was having trouble seeing because his goggles were cracked. "Dad, are you okay? I can't move my right arm. Dad?" When his dad didn't answer, he took a deep breath and summoned his strength. He tried to ignore the numb feeling in his left arm as he slowly removed his helmet and goggles. He then took his scarf and wiped the blood from his face. As he got his first good look around, he realized where he was and instinctively wrapped his arm tightly around the tree. The branch was about 65 feet up and his body was tightly wedged in. His right arm was pinned firmly against the tree by the pack that he had tried so hard to hold on to. "Where's Dad?" he thought as he searched the ground frantically around the bottom of the tree. He began to work loose his pinned arm from the pack and gasped as needles of pain started moving up and down his arm. After he had rubbed feeling back into his arm, he noticed that the other strap was broken. "Dad must have slid out of the pack when we were thrown from the snowmobile. If I'm okay, maybe everyone else is okay too," he thought with hope. The unbroken strap had snagged on a tree branch as he crashed to the treetop, bringing him to a stop. The pack he had clung onto so desperately, trying not to let go of his father, had saved his life. Colt looked up at the broken tree branches above him that he had come crashing through, then looked down at the ground far below, wondering how he was going to get down. Carefully he slid the pack from the branch where he had gotten caught and tied the broken strap ends back together. He then swung it slowly around behind him and strapped it on. It was very quiet on the mountain now, and he could feel his heart racing as he realized he was all alone and had no idea where his family was. He tried to push the rising fear for his missing family deep inside and began to make his way carefully down the tree. The death toll had rocketed up to 124. Nightfall was rapidly approaching, and the fact that no survivors had been found had the search party's spirits very low. The weather had begun to decline, and the chance of finding survivors looked very slim. All search parties were ordered back to the resort, which had been converted into a base of operations. News teams had been separated to another large area and were not permitted near them to limit distractions. Team after team began to report in until finally all the teams were safe and accounted for. "Come on, John, let me make one more pass," Carl asked for the 5th time as he walked quickly behind the base commander to check in with the other returning search parties. "Fine, Carl," John said wearily, "but just one more. Nightfall is coming fast and the wind is picking up. Be careful out there." "Got it. Thanks, John," he said as he ran towards his helicopter, yelling for his crew at the same time. John watched him go, praying that he would find someone, but knowing it was probably too much hope for now. Colt leaned wearily against the trunk of the tree, fighting exhaustion. He felt as if he had been climbing forever. It had been slow going, and his body was aching from the wild ride of the avalanche and the impact of smashing through the treetop. He was still about 30 feet from the ground, but he had run out of branches to drop onto. The rest of the trunk stretching toward the ground was completely free of branches. Refusing to give up, he looked down towards the ground with determination. "I could just slide down it," he thought to himself. He began to wrap his arms and legs around the tree and then sat back with frustration as he realized the tree was too fat for him to reach around. His arms were weakened with pain and exhaustion. There was no way he could hold on for very long. "I just have to do it," he said to himself. "I can't just stay here. I've got to at least try." He braced his mind for the pain he knew he was about to feel and prepared to begin his descent when an idea suddenly came to him. "I'll use the pack," he thought excitedly to himself. Sliding the pack off, he wrapped a strap around one of his wrists, then flung the pack around the backside of the tree. Catching the other strap in his opposite hand, he began wrapping it around that wrist as well. "I hope my knot holds," he thought warily. He leaned back slightly, testing his weight against the strength of the pack. "This is so much better," he thought, feeling hopeful for the first time since the avalanche. "If this holds, I should be able to slide right down." He did another quick sweep of the ground around the tree looking for his father as he summoned the courage to slide off the branch. As his weight settled, pulling against the pack, the knot he had tied earlier slipped a bit, nearly causing Colt's heart to stop. He checked the knot again and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself as he realized that the shift of his weight had actually drawn the knot tighter. "Phew, that was a close one," he breathed as he looked down at the ground far below. He finally reached the bottom a couple minutes later and found that he was reluctant to let go of the tree and step onto the ground. All he could think of was how terrifying it had been earlier as the snow roared down the mountain. "Well, I guess it's too late to worry about it now. I can't hang on to the bottom of this tree forever." Slowly he planted his feet on the snow, expecting at any moment for it to swallow him alive as it had earlier. When nothing happened, he finally released the tree and sat at the bottom to rest and think about his next move. "I've got to find Mom and Dad," he thought to himself determinedly. Colt threw his pack back on and began searching the area for his parents and 2 sisters. He wandered through the destroyed woods for hours, forcing his aching body to keep moving as he yelled as loud as he could. "Mom! Dad! Mom! Dad! Can you hear me? Sandy! Candy! Where are you?" He kept yelling until his voice finally gave out. He wanted to keep moving, but his body refused to listen to him. Frustrated and hungry, he finally sat down on a fallen tree, yanking off the pack and sitting it down beside him. He stared around at the empty valley around him. He felt despair rising and quickly opened the pack to distract himself. He grabbed a chicken leg from one of the containers and began to eat as he continued examining the many pockets of the pack. He was elated when he noticed that one of the pockets actually had some things that might actually help him. He took out and examined the compass, tiny flashlight, small plastic container full of matches, and the spool of string. A long knife was the last thing in the pocket and was almost as long as the pack. He drew it out cautiously and looked at it with huge eyes. "This is one humongous knife. I wonder why Dad has a knife this big with the emergency kit." Colt carefully put the knife and other things back in his pack and grabbed a bowl of potato salad. After taking a few small bites, he put the top back on and thought to himself, "I'd better save this for when I find everyone. They are going to be hungry too. He felt better now that he had eaten and rested, so after packing up he continued to search for his family. Darkness was slowly creeping up on him as he pushed slowly through the wilderness. A low sound stopped him in his tracks. His heart accelerated as it slowly got closer and much louder. He started to calm down again as he realized it wasn't the sound of another avalanche, but the sound of a helicopter coming from the direction he had just come from. They can help me find my family, he thought, full of renewed hope. Maybe they're already safe and they're just looking for me. Colt took off running as quickly as he could through the deep snow toward the sound, cutting back through the track he had already cut. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was still gone from all the yelling he had done earlier. He pressed onward, knowing the helicopter was still some distance away. Dark started to fall around him, and he struggled to see as he floundered through the deep snow around him. The helicopter was being tossed around as they searched the mountainside for any sign of life. There were only a few more minutes of daylight left when the helicopter spotter shouted, "There's something down there. I think someone's trying to signal us." "Hold on a minute," Carl the pilot said. "I'll get you closer." He slowly lowered the copter closer to the ground as everyone strained to see where the spotter was pointing. "You're right, lower me down now," the rescue jumper yelled out. "Just give me a second to stabilize," Carl yelled back. A minute later they slowly lowered the jumper down towards the bright red stain that stood out boldly against the white snow. The rescue worker reached the ground and shouted, "Where are you? We're here to rescue you. Hello?" When no one answered, he stopped to examine the signal more closely. His face was filled with horror as he realized that what the spotter had thought was a signal was actually a massive amount of blood covering the snow. No way anyone survived losing that much blood, he thought to himself. He searched the area looking for the source of the blood as he prepared his mind for what he knew he was going to find. He saw some frozen blood on a nearby tree that had been ripped apart by the avalanche, leaving only a jagged piece of trunk and some lower branches. As he looked up, he saw the body of a middle-aged man entangled amongst the branches. His body lay lifeless and broken. His head had been almost completely severed when his body had been thrown onto the jagged trunk as it fell from the cliff above. "It's another body," he radioed up to the helicopter hovering above, "and it's a pretty bad one, too." The team went quickly to work, freeing the man's body and loading it onto the sled. The euphoria they had felt a short time before had faded into a grim silence as they tried to get the grisly job done as fast as possible. They activated the winch and pulled the body onto the chopper, and then the sled was lowered again to retrieve the rescue worker. "Well, that's it," Carl said with resignation when the worker was back on board. "We've got to get back to base." Cole could see the helicopter heading in his direction. "It's too dark. They'll never see me," he thought desperately, waving his arms over his head as he ran towards the chopper. Thinking quickly, he stopped and grabbed the tiny flashlight from his bag and began jumping up and down, pointing it at the chopper. The light was small but powerful, and it shone like a beacon through the night. Carl felt adrenaline course through him as he saw the tiny light bobbing up and down in the distance. "Look!" he shouted back at the crew as he pointed towards it. "Do you see it? Do you see it?" "Yes," the crew hollered as they sprang into action, their strength renewed by hope and excitement. Carl radioed the base, yelling happily, "We have one! Repeat, we found a survivor!" Colt felt relief fill him as the helicopter spotlight shone down on him and a sled started descending towards him. The sled was barely to the ground when Colt dove onto it. His dislike of flying was completely forgotten in his desire to get out of the wilderness and find his family. Colt was pulled on board by two men who started to immediately check him for injuries as they asked him what had happened. He tried to tell them what happened to him, but his voice still hadn't recovered. As he was being checked, the helicopter had started moving quickly away from where he had been picked up. "Where are we going?" he thought frantically. "We need to look for my family." Colt grabbed the rescue worker on the arm, trying to get him to understand that they needed to go back and search for his family. The rescue worker couldn't understand him. The noise of the helicopter was too loud and Colt's voice too damaged. The worker misunderstood Colt's panic for his family as panic over the ordeal he had gone through that day. He patted Colt awkwardly on the head. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." Colt, growing more anxious, tried to speak louder. "My family! We've got to find my family." It was no use. His voice was too far gone. Colt put his hands on his head in frustration and lowered it as he rested his elbows on his knees. As he sat in the helicopter feeling hopeless, he noticed an arm with lines of dried blood on it, sticking out from under a shroud on the helicopter floor. The rescue worker noticed the disturbed look that had come across Colt's face and quickly covered the deceased man's arm, attempting to spare him from any further distress. But it was too late. Colt had already seen the watch that he and his sisters had picked out for his dad last Christmas wrapped around the lifeless wrist. Colt fell to his knees beside the stretcher and pulled the shroud off his father's face. He felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He'd always thought of his dad as being indestructible. Seeing his father, his idol and hero, lying there lifeless and broken, filled him with so much pain he could barely breathe. The worker, realizing with horror that it was someone Colt knew, placed his arm around him in an attempt to comfort him and gently pulled the sheet back over Jim's face. Colt's eyes filled with tears as he stayed kneeling next to his father's body, praying that his mothers and sisters were okay. When the helicopter arrived back at the resort, it was met by dozens of news crews and rescue teams, eager to get a look at the sole survivor of the avalanche. Hundreds of flashbulbs from the news cameras blinded him, and he was bombarded with questions as he stepped off the helicopter. Gripping his father's pack tightly, he turned and watched as his father's body was unloaded from the chopper. Silent tears coursed down his face as he followed close behind the stretcher as it was carried inside. Once inside the resort, Colt tried to follow his father's stretcher. Carl, the pilot of the helicopter, gently grabbed him on the shoulder. "I need you to come with us, please. We need to get you checked out." Colt took one long look at the stretcher and then followed Carl down a long hallway into a room full of people. There were beds lining the walls, all empty. As Colt sat on one of the beds getting his injuries checked, he looked around in amazement. "Am I the only one they found?" he wondered. "Mom, Sandy, and Candy have to be okay. They just have to be." An older man walked into the room and walked over to where Colt was sitting. He smiled kindly at Colt and introduced himself. "My name is John, and I'm in charge here. Do you think you can tell me your story?" Colt looked up at him and whispered, "We need to find my mom and sisters." John patted him on the shoulder. "We're still looking, son. Just tell me what happened. Take your time." The room fell silent and a crowd slowly gathered as Colt began to whisper the story of the day's tragic events. The story spread like wildfire. It didn't take long until Colt Connors and his story were all over the news on every channel. The orphan who had survived the avalanche had possibly become an orphan again. Pretty soon the entire nation was behind him, cheering for the safe recovery of his mother and sisters. Over the next few days, volunteers from all over the country began to pour into the resort to help with the search.